really appreciate the opportunity to be with you this afternoon. Scott, I was thinking to myself as I was sitting there, I was like, how did St. Louis Park and I get so lucky to go last, right? I couldn't imagine, like, how did I get so lucky? Because as I was reflecting, I couldn't stop thinking about how thankful I am for every speaker that's had an opportunity to present to us today and how just thankful and full I felt, right? It reminded me of just a week ago as I was sitting watching football and thinking about how full I felt, and I said to myself, well, maybe, right, I can engage and motivate people like I was motivated to go get that dessert. So I want you to think of me, okay, as the dessert of the AMSD annual conference. But in all seriousness, being that when we have a pretty heavy topic to cover in a short period of time, I want to introduce some team members that I have with me, understanding that there will be several questions when I'm done that you'll have. And they'll be helpful in maybe filling in some of the blanks that you may miss. So if you could just put your hand up or stand as I mentioned you. But today with me from St. Louis Park, I have Frida Bailey, who's a principal on special assignment. She currently leads and supports all of our instructional equity coaches, who I'll talk about here shortly. So she could provide you some insight on the level of support and professional development that they need in order to instill and build capacity within our staff. We also have one of our teachers here, Nellie Corman, who I think brings a great, unique perspective, because not only is she a teacher in our district, but she's a leader in another district and has worked in other districts, so she can provide you with some perspective on what it's like to be a teacher and be coached through this model. We have our Director of Curriculum and Instruction, Patrick Duffy, here, who can provide you some context on what it looks like to not only lead in this area, but provide collaboration or intersection between the professional development we offer and the curriculum that we're offering as our teachers are becoming more racially conscious. Because as you see more and know more, there's a hunger, a desire to influence the curriculum that you've been provided. We also have our Director of Assessment, Research, and Evaluation here, Prachi Mukherjee, who can provide you some insight on how over the years we've worked to assess the effectiveness of this model. And what we've tried to do is create some internal and external accountability measures to really see, is this working? Is this getting us the intended outcomes that we're looking for? We also have our Director of Student Services, Tammy Reynolds, here. And she provides a unique perspective because she's one of the longest tenured members of our cabinet, but also leading special education. She can tell you about the evolution that she's seen over the years of the implementation of this model and how it's impacted our over-identification of Black and brown students in special education. And last but not least, we have one of our board members here, Ann Casey. And for the board members in the room, as I start to unpack some of this and you're wondering, well, how does your community feel about it and how do I respond? She can provide you some insight on what's required of her as a board member to be able to lead and support the work that we're doing in St. Louis Park. So I'm gonna kind of fly through some of this, but know all of those people sitting at that table can be resources to you. And I know they'll be more than happy to come out and meet with you or take time on the phone to go deeper in some of the things that we'll discuss today. Where I want to start is really with the belief that we hold around racial equity instructional coaching. And before I go too deep there, what I want to say is that we don't operate from this premise that there's a such thing as a magic bullet, right? That this is the tool or strategy that's getting us the results that we desire. We recognize that it requires an integrated set of collective practices that are implemented consistently over time, right? So this is just one of the strategies that we're using that is helping us accelerate our work around accomplishing the strategies of Reimagine Minnesota and the strategies of our strategic plan. We started this model in 2013-14 school year, and I'll show you a short video here that kind of unpacks this more, but it really started because our teachers were hungry for more. What they realized is really that first sentence there is that systemic racial equity change transpires when educators are given the space and support to critically reflect on their own racial consciousness and practice. So we started off with just 2 coaches, right? So we've been a QComp district forever, but we started off with 2 racial equity instructional coaches, and then we had the rest of our coaches on that very traditional QComp model. How many QComp districts do we have here? Right, so you all are very familiar, so I won't go into a lot of detail about the model, but over time, it gained momentum, so we went from 2 to 5, and now we're currently at 9. And when we started, there were some teachers that were receiving coaching, and they had to opt in. They had to say, hey, I want my coaching to be focused on racial equity and really focusing on who I am as an instructor, because I hear Patrick say this often. I think one of his professors at the U of M said this, is that we teach two things as educators, right? We teach who we are and we teach our content. And what we believe in St. Louis Park is that as educators, if we're teaching who we are, but who we are is absent of the narrative of all of the students that we're serving, we run the risk of not being able to meet them where they're at or be responsive to the learning needs that we have. So this model really allows us to really open up, create a larger window around who we are and how we see the world, so that when we're teaching who we are, it's more inclusive of all of the different communities and populations that we serve in St. Louis Park. And what I want to also try to do is, through all of this, because it's not just ice cream and cake and bubble gum, right? There's challenges that go along with having a model like this as well. And so I want to try to share some lessons learned and lessons that we're continuing to learn as we implement this model. And one of the pieces that I would like to offer is that there's such a high level of consideration that needs to be given to having a very coherent model connected to this. And what I mean is, what we've recognized over time is that, particularly at the cabinet level, is that we were operating in silos. So, for example, Frida, who was responsible for supporting and guiding racial equity coaches, that the work of racial equity kind of became the work of Frida and the racial equity coaches, right? And what we know is that the work of racial equity is all of our work. So we have to really be intentional about the integration of the work that we do. So we have IB coaches, racial equity coaches, reading coaches, and at the end of the day, regardless of the title that you have, it is all of our responsibility to lead for racial equity. So what we've done from a very in a very intentional way is try to integrate the work of all of those individual coaches, so that we're all communicating similar messages. Because there was a period in time in which teachers were like, well, I don't know who I listen to. Do I listen to my racial equity coach? Do I listen to my IB coach? Do I listen to my reading coach? So one of the lessons learned is the importance around coherence and making sure that everything is working together. And since I'm mentioning coherence, the last slide, which I won't take time to go through, I shared with you Michael Fullen and Quinn's coherence framework from the book that they produced in 2015. And so the piece I was really trying to describe there, connected to that, was that focused direction, making sure that everything is working together as we move the work forward. I won't spend time going deeply here, because I saw several hands raised as we talked about QComp. The piece that I just wanted to point out here is that the purpose of our instructional coaching model in St. Louis Park is to build educators' will, skill, and capacity to disrupt systemic racism in order to impact student achievement and experiences in St. Louis Park Public Schools. So our purpose is very clear. And if we had more time, I would have you at your tables reflect on what is the purpose of your QComp model in your district, right? And is that purpose of your QComp model aligned with your strategic plan? And if not, why? Right? And what can be done to create greater alignment so that that purpose is really driving you to the results that you believe in. Ever since she said it, I can't get it out of my mind, but Dr. Alexander said, budgets are human values with price tags, right? So what we're saying in St. Louis Park is that budget that we get for QComp, right, what we're saying our value is the interruption of systemic racism in our district. So the piece that was interesting about all of this is that we really started this model organically prior to our 15-20 strategic plan being developed. And that because of the work that was happening in 13, 14, 14, 15, it really, in my opinion, even though I wasn't there, so those of you that were there, if I'm talking out of turn, let me know, but it really led to a more racially conscious strategic plan, which now has really supported and allowed us to go even deeper in all different areas across our organization. What I want to do next is just show you a quick video that highlights the program. And then what I'll do after that is just speak a little bit about what our racial equity coaches do on a daily basis. And then I want to bring up my colleagues and open it up for questions, because there may be a lot of things that you're thinking about.
Closing the racial opportunity gap is a persistent challenge nationwide and in St. Louis Park Public Schools. For more than 15 years, we have been focused on systemic racial equity transformation. It aligns with our mission and core values. When you believe that everyone has equal intrinsic worth, anything becomes possible. We are moving the needle. Today, graduation rates for Black and brown boys in St. Louis Park Public Schools are exceeding their peers from other districts, and students of color are self-reporting increased engagement in school. 15 years ago, as a system, we believed we could think our way to a solution. We researched and engaged in professional development to learn how to change the behaviors of historically marginalized students, Black, brown, and Indigenous students. After implementation of multiple approaches to change student behaviors, we were not seeing a shift in student-teacher relationships, nor any substantial gains in student achievement. Until 2 high school teachers tipped the concept of education equity on its head. They asked themselves, what would happen if teachers started to examine their personal beliefs and biases towards students of color? Do students of color achieve at higher levels when teachers acknowledge the presence and role of whiteness in education? Our professional development shifted toward a new concept. District administration, principals, teachers, and staff began to focus on their own personal racial equity journeys. By working with Pacific Educational Group, St. Louis Park Public Schools engaged in a courageous conversation about race. St. Louis Park began using a common language to sustain and deepen the conversation about race while keeping students at the center. From this shift in focus, the E12 Racial Equity Instructional Coaching Model was born. Through this model, educators are given the space to critically reflect on their own racial consciousness and interrupt the presence of racism in their classrooms. Using the Courageous Conversation Protocol, tenets of critical race theory, systems thinking tools, and instructional coaching methods, we are working together to close the racial opportunity gap. This work is made possible by the partnership between St. Louis Park Public Schools and the Park Association of Teachers. Our teachers actively voted to use some of their alternative professional pay system dollars to support this work. The union has publicly taken the position that the purpose of ATPPS is to build educators' will, skill, and capacity to disrupt systemic racism in order to impact student achievement and experiences at St. Louis Park Public Schools. And it's paying off. We are closing the racial opportunity gap in St. Louis Park Public Schools. Together we learn, grow, and continually examine the impact of race and culture on learning. We listen closely to the voices of students, believing that through persistent effort, in an equitable environment, all learners can achieve maximum performance. Beyond the school walls, racial equity transformation work is happening across our system, in parent-teacher organizations, site councils, and community education. There is more work to be done. Closing the racial opportunity gap is a persistent challenge for educators. In St. Louis Park, the work begins and ends with the adults in the room as they understand their personal racial equity purpose.
So I should have, before I showed the video, just prefaced the fact that what I recognize as I show that is that the social and political context of the communities that each of us are in are different, right? They vary, and I fully recognize, and I'm thankful, I'm humbled and honored to be able to work in a community that views the importance of racial equity at that level. So I say that knowing that not all of our communities are the same way, and I say that not suggesting that, you know, that is the only pathway, right? I think it's important that if you take anything from this is to, you know, go back and take a closer look at the purpose of QComp, and is that aligned with the strategic plan and direction of your organization? And if not, then what is developmentally appropriate for your organization to start moving that closer and getting greater alignment? So, because as I was sitting there watching it, I'm saying to myself, well, yeah, that's awesome, but that can't happen everywhere, right? Because the conditions have not yet been set. But I believe as we take the time to start to build the conditions in order to do that type of collaboration between the teachers union and the community can happen. What you don't hear there is that not only at the school district level, but at the city level, right? Our city council and our mayor is working actively around, city ordinances and city government to make sure that racial equity is alive and well there is also. So I wanted to mention that, but I also think it's important that we really think about the alignment between, this great resource that we have from the state and how is that helping us accomplish the goals that we set forth. Just briefly, we talked about the purpose around, skill, will, and, ultimately getting to increasing or developing capacity. And just like in most traditional ATPPS programs or instructional coaching models, our staff are supporting teachers with their professional development plans. Our staff are supporting guided reflection. They're doing all of these pieces. They're just doing it through the lens of race and how race impacts the lives of the adults that are in front of students every single day. I've added several slides of just perspectives from staff. I won't go into detail about it. And it's really about just the impact on each of those staff members' critical consciousness. And the theme that you'll see through all of that is that it's about them as an individual, right? We hold a belief, I hold a belief that I can't come to work and be a super racially conscious person and then go home and operate in this homogeneous vacuum that is absent of people that I work with on a daily basis. So what you'll see, and I have several of these examples where staff are just saying, hey, it impacted me first, this is how it impacts my daily lived experiences, and because of that, I'm a different teacher in the classroom. So what I would like to do at this time is just invite up some of my colleagues and open it up to questions, because again, that was a high level overview, and I'm recognizing that there may be some more specific questions about, well, what is this and how did you do it and how is it working? So if my colleagues would be willing to come up and we can answer some questions that you may have.
All right, and I'll bring a microphone if we have questions.
I have a question. Patrick,
Go ahead.
would you be, since, and I recognize it's hard going last, but if you would be willing to just talk about, well, how do you align professional development? So if all of your teachers are getting individualized racial equity coaching, how is that influencing their desire for more racially conscious professional development, more racially conscious curriculum? And then as a director of curriculum, what do you do to make sure that there's an intersection or alignment there?
That's a great question.
All right. I got to have some more.
Okay. So, I'm fairly new to the district, and one of the things that I really appreciate is all of the work that's happened to kind of lead to where we are today around the work in St. Louis Park, and I think as I've kind of done a historical look back and talked to many people about the work, I don't think that what's happened in St. Louis Park is that different from a lot of the journeys that many of us across the region have taken to try to address systemic racism. I think a lot of the way that teachers originally saw the work was, how do we fix the kids to close our gaps? And then we went from that to saying, how are we addressing the adult dysfunction in the system? And a lot of that interruption of adult dysfunction ended up becoming the way that we defined racial equity. But really the work that I'm seeing right now throughout the district are people committed to transforming the experiences in their classrooms. So what we've tried to do in our professional development is really focus on looking at how we're going to affirm the values in our strategic plan and look at how we're going to get adults to learn together and how they're going to focus on the learning experiences of their children. And what we say often is that if you're racially conscious and vulnerable in your collaboration time, and we can model that amongst ourselves as leaders in the district, and then if we can also find that we are giving some specific application, not just theory, but ways for them to apply culturally relevant pedagogy to the classroom, then we can have conversations about that at a really deep level. And I think it comes from this belief that we have that if we're raising racially conscious children, and if we're raising, and developing racially conscious staff, we're going to raise test scores that will be byproduct not the focus of our work, but it'll be a byproduct of developing those democratic values.
That's a great segue, because I was looking at St. Louis Park's MCA data, and I know you all are investing all of your QComp dollars in racial equity coaching, but your data looks just like everybody else's data, right? We got gaps. So, Prati, would you be willing to talk a little bit about how do we measure their effectiveness, right? How are we using internal and external accountability measures to look at this?
Before I answer that question, you can probably tell I'm a woman of color. I'm a first-generation immigrant. And as the district embarked on this journey of racial equity consciousness building, I too was part of that. And as I began to examine how race has played a role in my life and my career, I come back to my research and assessment and all the methodologies that I've learned with a fresh pair of eyes in terms of the objectivity and this universality of norms. So I just want to put it out there that I'm not an objective tool, an objective researcher, just measuring things, as if it has nothing to do with me. Given that, I think one analogy that will probably resonate very well in the United States of America today is that we talk about the problem of obesity that we are currently faced with. And it's not that people who have all the information and knowledge about proper nutrition, exercise, etc., even they fail to do the actions that will put them back on a path of health. So knowing that, when we compare that with our teachers who are being given all this information to reflect on how race has played a role in shaping who they are, what their expectations are, then simply having that knowledge does not lead to immediate transformation so that they start teaching differently and seeing every student as capable of achieving the high standards, and we see immediate results in student achievement data. So understanding that kind of pathway and also understanding that this is the first time anything like this has been undertaken. We started by looking at, and Frida was with me when we first started in 2013-14 with a couple of high school teachers who had this idea and who were working with a consultant with this idea that we want to use the coaching model to engage teachers in a conversation about race and what does that have to do with the classroom. We were all in a place of learning, not exactly knowing how this is going to play out. But one thing was clear is that the first change that would happen would be in how the teachers were reflecting on their practice. So in order to make this, these conversations, which are confidential between a coach, an instructional equity coach and a teacher, we have done pre and post surveys every year. And we ask very pointed questions about race and racism, in addition to the usual questions of, strongly agree, disagree kind of a thing. And what I can share with you is over the years, if I compared 2013 with the last time we collected this data was last year, is that the responses have become much more, have much more depth. They are much more personal, they're much more vulnerable, and it's not just about, oh, I have another strategy now in my toolbox, and my toolbox is growing bigger. But it's turning inward, which is a challenge because in this culture, we are always constantly looking outward. What is the newest bullet? What is the newest program? So we see a qualitative shift in the responses, and the teachers are also discovering the interconnectedness, that race is not just present in the classroom, but in the school and the communities, and that they have a role in not only themselves, but also in how they are equipping their students to think about and dismantle racism or speak up in the face of racism. So mostly it has been in the form of surveys, and then the other thing has been some University of Minnesota partnerships that we've had. I don't know if Mary Bussman is in the room, I don't think so. So she did her PhD, her doctoral work in our district on the equity coaching model. And then we've had several University of Minnesota students, doctoral students who have undertaken qualitative studies of our district.
What about students? How are students experiencing through the student engagement survey?
Yes, we have done the student engagement survey of the 5 C's, and right from the outset, it has shown us high student engagement, high levels of student engagement. So as the measurement people know in the room, when a survey gives you very high levels of data, no matter what you look at, any level, any group, then you start thinking about, is this the right survey, or are we able to measure changes using this survey?
And I don't know how much time we have left, but if we have about one more minute. Oh, we got a question. I had another question if we did.
I just have so much appreciation for the way that you're acknowledging the role of those two teachers in your story, and about how their courage to look inward was the basis that kind of moved a lot of this work forward. Can you just share a little bit more about what it was that those two teachers were doing, and was that the basis of the QComp model that you have, or did they become coaches? Or I just really appreciate that you made that part of the video, and then you spoke to it as well, and that interests me.
Sure. So with the two teachers at the high school, they were building instructional leaders. And so what that meant was they were kind of following some of the QComp information, the guidelines basically of what's expected of a teacher who is also working in that instructional capacity. And so while working with teachers, they were having teachers ask a lot about strategies, as was mentioned earlier, or what do I need to do with this student? It was more of, can you give me information on how to work with Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, more so than what is it as a teacher I need to do. And so gathering that information, because with those two teachers, they also had some survey information that Prachi would have with them. She would meet with them privately to gather more information on what is it that we need to do next in the model. And so that kind of started the conversation. This was some using Jim Knight's work and some other instructional practices, more so than looking at it through the racial lens, but based upon the conversation that they were having with the teachers, they kept hearing the narratives of what to do with these students. And so that's when the conversation started to shift a little bit about we need to look at the model in a different way.
I just recalled something I had in the year when we still had the building instructional leaders and the equity coaches. I had conducted interviews with each of the building instructional leaders and the equity coaches, and a remarkable difference in their responses. I asked them, why did you want to be a build or an equity coach? The remarkable difference was that every single building instructional leader said, I like to be at the table when decisions are made. I am a leader and I like to be a leader. Whereas the equity coaches talked about how they wanted to bring about systemic change for the betterment of all.
Hi, I'm Andrea Keene. I serve on the Wayzata School Board. My question is about something you mentioned about creating the conditions in your community where you're prepared to start to do this kind of work effectively. I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit what you meant by that.
Yeah, certainly. So I can maybe start and pass it around, because while I'm a resident there as well, this is only my second year in the district, but what I meant essentially was that, so the school district, because of the courageous action of those teachers and the process, the school district really served as a model for our city. Now, we have a unique situation where our school district boundaries are contiguous with our city boundaries, so we're not interfacing with multiple city councils or mayors or city managers, but that really allowed us, because of our close relationship, that allowed us to be in communication constantly about what we're doing, and at the same time pushing and challenging the city, what are they doing, right? And through that process, that really started to increase their desire for more information and consciousness development, to where they, at a city level, and this is uncommon, I don't know any cities besides St. Paul and Minneapolis that have a racial equity coordinator at the city level, right? But St. Louis Park does, and I think it's a result of the work that started at our high school in 2013-14. And I don't know if anybody else would like to add to that.
So I could say that when the two teachers were working on this model, and then when we had what we call a split model at the time, it was building instructional leaders and then having our equity instructional coaches. One of the things that they were really intentional about was giving information, putting it in the front of everyone in the building and in the communities. So what they would do was go to each site, share about their role, what they would bring to the table, and besides working with classroom teachers. And then they would also have attend what we call our parent-teacher organizational meetings, PTOs, site councils. So they would have conversations to give everyone the information about what does this mean when we start to talk about race. And then what does that mean and how will it impact my child if a teacher's talking about race? And what they did after that was also had a meeting with board members and principals and kind of provided some background knowledge about what does this mean for St. Louis Park. When we say the word race, racism, systemic racism, what does that mean and how do we all hear that at the same level? And so it's giving that common understanding about the terms that are being used, what that means, how it would impact